Okay, it looks like straight up 1 p.m. Hello, good afternoon, Information Universe. It's Wednesday. It's not just Wednesday, it's the third Wednesday of the month, and that means it's Webinar Wednesday for us here at IQBG and Mint Group. Hello, everyone. My name is Todd Verrill with IQ Business Group, and I'm very happy to be your moderator for another great topic that we're repeating due to popular demand. Today's webinar: Navigating Information Governance and Compliance with Microsoft 365. I'm joined today by my pal, Ryan Britton, Senior Microsoft Consultant, and my colleague at IQBG Marketing, Maggie Vandenberg. Guys, before we dive into information governance and compliance strategies in 365, real quick, couple of housekeeping items. Please do submit your questions through the webinar chat. That is being monitored by Maggie for Q&A later in the show, and also be prepared for some poll questions along the way so we can get your feedback. Also, today's webinar will be made available to all of you for replay within about 24 hours. So please be on the lookout for an email notification. Thanks for being here again. So as part of our Webinar Wednesday series, we are proud to sponsor today's webinar in support of our public and private sector network, including federal, state, and local government, and our private sector friends who are all seeking knowledge and insight to make the most of Microsoft 365 investments. For those who have joined us before, thanks for joining us again. You can bump us forward there, Maggie, please. And for those we haven't had the pleasure of meeting before, welcome. Introduction, as always, IQBG. We are a leading provider of records and information management solutions for the public sector and highly regulated industries. We've been doing this for a while, folks. Since 2008, IQBG has been developing ECRM and content services solutions for highly regulated industries, including public and private sectors that always leverage some sort, some ratio, some part, some recipe, Ryan, of people, process, technology, but always supporting your requirements.
Thank you, Todd. Always great to spend some time with you. Introduction quickly to myself. I'm Ryan Britton. I work for an organization called the Mint Group, which is a global Microsoft consultancy, very active inside of highly regulated industries, both public and private sector, with a very long list of gold certifications and a 20-year history of being a top-tier Microsoft partner. And we're very pleased to be here to be talking about a subject that some may think of as dry, but it doesn't have to be, because it's pretty exciting when you get into the weeds with it. And over to you, sir.
Yeah, absolutely, Ryan. And I'll start by just saying what we're going to dive into again is not a new problem, and it's kind of like the timing is fitting. Only we're at the end of summer, but it's kind of like retaking a class through summer school, and this class is definitely worthy of a retake, and that's why we're offering it again today. The problem we face is this: everyone, again, is faced with information management challenges to support their business requirements, and in there are going to be compliance requirements. Not only that, the terms like ECRM, enterprise, content, records management, EIM, enterprise information management, those things have shifted to what we now pretty much all experience daily as content services within the Microsoft 365 information ecosystem. So it's always going to be, or if it wasn't, I should say, difficult enough to do before. Making sufficient progress in developing InfoGov programs is quite the chore, but that is where we come in. IQBG and Mint are focused on not only InfoGov, but on this shift and on the growth of content services with Microsoft 365. So now more than ever, these connected things, if you will, require an outcome-focused approach to address InfoGov. planning and managing the apps, products, and services that drive your business. And with that, I'm alluding to what we call smart compliance. It is an outcome as a service offering designed to provide sort of a turnkey solution for compliance and governance keywords within the modern workplace. And we work together to do this through a combination of consultation, industry best practices, and managed services. To help provide a little bit more insight into your InfoGov pain points, leveraging Microsoft 365, I will pass it back to Ryan, who is our senior Microsoft consultant on the call. Welcome again, Ryan.
Thank you. Yes, so as you know, Todd, IQ and Mint have been solving this problem for a number of years now as it's continued to get more complex. And as we've implemented multiple successful information governance programs for different types of organizations, mostly inside of highly regulated industries, we've developed a methodology which you can see on screen now. It's fairly complex looking at it in this format, but it's a complex problem that we're trying to solve, and there's a lot of things that feed into it. If you speak to certain people, they might make it seem like an easy problem to solve. You take all of your information, you throw it in the cloud, you apply some technology on top of it, and magically you have a compliant environment. And I think anybody who has tried to do that or has some experience in the space will know that, you know, magic is something that might exist in many forms in our world, but compliance is a place that it's rarely found. And so there's a lot of methodologies and practices and things that apply in a very complex manner in order to dovetail into a total solution. And some of those things involve, you know, management of physical records as much as the cloud is digitizing things. The truth of the matter is that physical records are still very much a part of day-to-day business for most organizations, and are probably going to be a part of a hybrid story for a number of years. And then how do you govern that information? How do you collaborate effectively on top of that governance? How do you protect your information and, you know, keep the family jewels safe, as it were? And then how do you start to layer on top of that security, you know, things that will make remote working possible and distributed working, where organizations are spread across the globe, where you might have different compliances that are being applied in different regions to information. And then what types of services do you need on top of that in order to create a complete picture in terms of being able to operate the compliance machinery on a day-to-day basis? And so there's a lot that goes into that, and we acknowledge this. And as we kind of go through the compliance piece, there are other things that would influence a compliance story, and really, you know, it's a much broader story. We're focusing on one element of it, and we're very acutely aware of that. Hopefully, a lot of what you take out of this will highlight the places that compliance is most important inside of this complex landscape. Okay, next slide here.
And just a quick pause to stop with our first poll question. Do you have compliance and governance strategies in place? And thanks for taking these polls, folks. This really helps us look at the information we provide and identify the problems that we're always trying to help solve. So getting it right from you is very helpful. Maggie will have our results in just a moment.
Okay, so we've got most of them in right now, and 34% of people say that yes, they do have a plan in place. 10% say they are unsure, and 55% say no, but it's part of their roadmap.
I think that's a pretty common response, Ryan. We see this a lot with capturing it in the roadmap, especially at this stage. Now it's getting to the how do we make it reality and execute and move forward.
Yeah, compliance seems like a destination, but it's really an ongoing journey. Okay, so we're going to start off and ease into this topic, and we're going to do that by asking a question which which if you've been in the game for a while might seem simplistic, and we're going to build towards some stuff that gets more complex. But we figured that it was a good idea for us to set the playing field, as it were, with a simple definition: what is compliance? And this may seem simplistic, but actually in a lot of cases we find that as we start to engage with organizations and start to talk about compliance, there's a lot of misunderstanding about what compliance represents. In some cases, we've been halfway through a meeting before someone says, oh, are we talking about something other than security compliance or data security or something along those lines? And really, it's a very broad definition, and it encompasses a lot of things, and data security is certainly an element, but it's not everything that's involved or under that umbrella. And so at its very basic level, it's a set of requirements that need to be followed by organizations. And in some cases, those requirements are formalized as laws, and you have to abide by them. In other cases, they are just rules that represent an expected set of practices that organizations inside of a community or inside of an industry will follow. In other cases, there may be a set of standards which represent an expectation of quality that comes out of certain organizations. And ultimately, that will result in some policies that organizations will implement in order to meet those rules, regulations, laws, and requirements. And essentially, if you had to sum it up in one sentence, it would be conforming to a specification, standard, regulation, or law that has been clearly defined. And so compliance is all about, and specifically information compliance is all about, to what level are you following those rules? And so you might be asking, okay, that's great, but how does compliance apply to me? Organizations are under an ever-increasing amount of scrutiny. Today, there are countless government regulations, industry standards, company procedures that have to be met. In fact, industry experts suggest that a global organization can face up to 15,000 separate regulations that mandate the specific handling of information. So consider that if you have an organization that is spread across several territories or intends to be spread across several territories, and that's not a huge leap anymore, because as you know, remote working becomes a reality for a lot of organizations, and they become more distributed and they can function quite easily across multiple territories. Consider being under the scrutiny of 15,000 separate regulations as a global organization. And certainly if you are sitting inside of even the US territories, you'll have separate regulations for each of the individual states, specific industry regulations that you need to follow. If you GDPR may not seem like it applies to you, but if you have European customers, it may very well apply to you. And so it's a very, very complex landscape. And while the high-profile failures of companies such as Enron and the Lehman Brothers has led to more stringent financial and data protection regulations worldwide, regulatory compliance laws and regulations such as Dodd-Frank Act, HIPAA, ISO, FISMA all impose their own approaches to record keeping and auditing. And then just to drive that home, here is a very partial list of regulations that we might be talking about. And if you browse through these, you may see some names that make sense or may be familiar to you. Global standards like the ISO standards, or US standards like the DoD standards, or perhaps the FIP standards if you're in the US government, or otherwise international standards like GDPR and so forth and so on. And what you'll see here is that this is a mix of not only security laws, which are about how you protect your information, but also privacy laws about what you are and are not allowed to do with people's personal information, and how you should manage that information, and how you are incumbent to be responsible with it. And then also other types of information, what you are and are not allowed to do with that. And so information governance is this very broad topic. And I suppose that then leads into the next most obvious question is, why do we care about all of these things? And the fact is that companies are aware that poor information management and non-compliance carry heavy penalties that lead to lost business and reputational damage, financial penalties, and even prison sentences. I was part of a very interesting conversation about a month back where they were talking about the potential for personal personal entity, people inside of the citizenship to start levying legal cases against organizations who are infringing on their rights as far as information management is concerned and privacy and so forth. And it's certainly a Pandora's box that is awaiting us in terms of what non-compliance to those types of regulatory statutes could imply. In some industries, failing an auditor's inspection can lead to an organization's operations being suspended until corrective action is taken. An organization doesn't need to comply, but it must be seen to comply. And achieving compliance requires the execution of best practices without error, as well as proving that the organization has done this through accurate information. Okay, and then just a slide that talks about information liability. If you've been following our webinar series, you probably saw this slide in a previous webinar as well. And essentially all it's talking about is the fact that there are substantial financial penalties that are being levied against organizations across the globe that are failing to comply with information statutes. And this is not just security, where information has been leaked or has been breached, but it is information that has been mismanaged as well. And you can see some of the fines. I'm not going to go through them, but they run into the hundreds of millions of dollars in terms of fines that are being levied at organizations that are high profile and in the media. And this is, besides the financial penalties, it also carries a reputational damage. In some cases, it's implied. There are certain social media organizations, for instance, that have such a reputation for mismanagement of information that it's going to be a very long journey for them to rebuild any kind of trust as far as their ability to be trusted with any kind of personal information. Okay, and so then that begs the question, what is information governance? And you'll hear this bandied around a lot when people are talking about compliance. It's really about an emerging responsibility to understand your information and to be able to manage your information in the way that is most appropriate to that type of info. And whereas a lot of organizations kind of have this amorphous understanding of their info. Perhaps they're able to say, well, this is the information that that belongs to that department, or this is the information that we consider to be a legal liability or to be in the purview of the legal department or something along those lines. But in many respects, a lot of organizations will point to a file share and say, well, all of our files are sitting there and we're not really sure what it's comprised of, how many of those files may represent a liability, and so forth. And really, information governance is about taking a different stance to that and taking responsibility for every single piece of information in the same way as you would asset track or stock manage other components of your business. And so information governance is an organization's coordinated interdisciplinary approach to satisfying information compliance requirements and managing information risks while optimizing information value. And that last part is really important because I think that's a bit of a lost component of information governance. We'll talk about that on a later slide. Essentially, there are three pillars that drive information governance. The one is that the organization is subject to informational legal requirements, and that's something that we've been talking about on these last few slides. The organization also faces information-related risks, and this may go beyond the compliance regulations that we've been talking about and may extend to things like legal preservation and these types of things. And then the organization's information and related practices have an economic impact through its value and its cost. There is a cost associated with information. There is a value that information delivers. And your ability to manage the costs and to maximize the value of your information is a strategy and a component of information governance in and of itself. Okay. And so then let's take a moment and talk about the macroeconomic indicators that we can see. And the point that we're trying to drive home here is that if you haven't picked it up from the slides leading up to this, we think that there is a reckoning coming as far as information governance is concerned. In the same way that financial responsibility is an expectation of all businesses, and you would never engage with a business that was irresponsible with the way that it managed and tracked its accounting. So there is an expectation that organizations start to have an accounting for their information and are able to label, track, classify, and manage that information effectively to the point where they can report on it and meet certain compliance requirements. And what are the macroeconomic indicators that we can see that kind of speak to this reckoning that is coming, if indeed it's not already upon us? Things like information privacy. We see numerous regulations, from international mandates to statewide decrees, that have sprouted up to protect consumers' rights to privacy. This has resulted in a fundamental shift in how data should be managed, and governance is a big part of that, according to Privacera's CEO, Balaji Ganeskan. Also, personalization. So at the same time that we're seeing all of this regulation around the responsibilities of folks to manage private information of individuals, we're also seeing a lot of organizations strive to get as much PII as possible in order to use that for marketing, in order to personalize their campaigns and so forth. And as that becomes a bit of a runaway train, so these regulations are trying to govern that in such a way that folks are protected from that effort. Managed services, regulations such as GDPR necessitate that organizations govern the use of their data vendors, prompting them to implement what Rob Chapman, Director of Security Architect at Cybera, calls a really good vendor management process, which is an understatement. But mounting cloud reliance amplifies this driver. So as folks are starting to become more dependent on vendors who provide a managed service, which includes managing their information, it becomes more and more critical that folks are able to extend these policies through to those vendor ecosystems. And obviously the policies that apply, or the responsibility still sits with that organization, even though it is a managed service that is underpinned this, a cloud service that they're consuming. And then the broadening data ecosystem. So the post big data age has contributed to a situation in which there's more data and more different kinds of data. So there are more things to which regulations apply, as stated by Irene Polikoff, CEO of Top Quadrant. And what that's talking about is that we're talking about the fact that we have produced more data in the last 5 years than in the rest of human history. And that in the last 7 years, we have doubled the amount of data that existed on the globe. And that we are growing at such an exponential rate, and that ecosystem is becoming so complex and interwoven that the ability to manage individual pieces of information is becoming more and more prevalent. And then finally, we're seeing a lot of high-profile security breaches where there's been a loss of control in private and confidential information. And these are growing in both frequency and in severity. We're seeing a lot of attempts to breach high-profile organizations in order to get information or to influence even things like elections within countries, as far as information management is concerned.
Okay, we've got another poll. We just want to know what you're trying to accomplish with your governance goals. Okay, looks like most people have voted. 26% of people say they are focused on meeting legal requirements. A full 50% say they are focused on protecting organizational IP and data. And the remainder are focused on creating governance strategies that drive cost efficiencies.
Thank you, Maggie. Okay, so let's talk about how organizations approach information governance. And this again is just a general observation, I suppose. What we find ordinarily as we consult on these types of endeavors is that folks approach compliance grudgingly. In other words, the law says I have to do X, Y, and Z, so I guess I'm going to have to do X, Y, and Z and expend money in order to get the right processes in place in order to be compliant in that regard, but I really don't want to. And then risk is normally approached reactively. We have a few examples where after having had discussions about the importance of compliance and the risk of not being compliant, etc., we will find that folks will not move on that risk until something actually happens in that regard. And so there's one good example of a client of ours now who at the time waited until they had an e-discovery case opened up against them for a client of theirs, and they had a keep everything policy. And as a result of that, the e-discovery produced a lot of damning information which would have otherwise have been disposed of as part of a disposition or what have you, rightly or wrongly. And as a result of that, the customer lost a court case. They had to pay millions of dollars worth of damages, and they fired our client as a client simply because they had mismanaged that customer's information and had 20 years worth of info lying around when they only had to legally maintain 7. And there's a lot more examples of organizations who wait until the point that a penalty has to be paid out or there is a financial burden that is incumbent on them as a result of not managing this risk effectively. And so it's really a reactive thing. And then value, and this is that side of information governance that we were talking about, where it's actually an economic contributor to an organization. It has value, it has cost. And that we find that a lot of organizations don't really consider that. They grudgingly pay very high storage costs for their information. And when you ask them what's in it, they say, I don't know. And if you say, what percentage of that potentially is working documents that are no longer needed, the answer is, I don't know. And, you're keeping that information because you want it to provide value over time. What percentage of your folks are going back and mining that information and finding knowledge for reuse? And organizations are not sure. But at the same time, we inherently know that there's value in information, so we keep it. There's also liability in information. And a lot of organizations could turn and say, well, how do we build a business case out of this? And we'll talk this, that's what it says at the bottom. How do we build a business case for information management? How do we use the fact that we can reduce our storage costs and use the fact that we can make people more productive and get knowledge reuse and quantify that in such a way that we can build a business case? In the process of doing that, you may actually find an economic case for implementing information governance within an organization. Food for thought. And what it boils down to is that there are essentially carrots and sticks, right? The sticks are the things that we normally find drive people towards compliance: reputational damage, financial liability, customer harm, informational costs, informational growth. We're trying to avoid all of these things, and therefore we have a compliance solution. And the carrots are less seldom things that we see, the attractors. And these are that reduced costs are a really, the best way to make money is to save money. And sometimes reducing your costs is a really good economic benefit that you can use inside of a business case. The value of the information. If people can't find information, it doesn't matter how valuable that information is because it can't be used. In efficiency of folks, if information is properly classified, available, discoverable, and everyone knows where to find it, people become more efficient. There are studies out there that say that in some office-based jobs, folks spend 30% of their time looking for information. If you could make that better, it makes the business more productive. Process automation, looking for in the process of understanding your information and classifying it and becoming more responsible with it, there are opportunities to automate, and those opportunities represent a reduction of admin for folks and an increase in productivity. And again, that's a good thing in terms of employee satisfaction. Lots of things that that feed into that story. And although this is really great, and what we're talking about doing here is using compliance to really build a business case for information governance, and that we believe that all organizations should be doing at this. They should be looking at it and saying, let's create a profit and loss of information, statement, and find out exactly what our costs are and what our benefits are, and weigh them up and create a business case and implement this with the intent of profiting from good information governance. All of this is really moot though, because business case considerations of risk and value are persuasive arguments for the organization, and they should do it. But missing from this business case equation is the first element, legal compliance, which converts should do into must do.
And this is so accurate. I always like this slide, Ryan, because many of the projects we take on, our folks are in that reactive mode. They've been down the path of they're paying the price. They have to pay penalties. They have to go through and take steps back before they can get to where they need to be because of the lack of information governance or the maturity of information governance in their enterprise. And we hear more times than not, as we go through the process, the exercises to get them there, the end users, the frontline workers, the folks who you'd put in that bullet of employee satisfaction, those are the ones who really come out and say, why didn't we do this sooner? Because trying to see through the forest to pick out those benefits that are outside of checking the box on compliance are not always very visual in the beginning. And by being able to emphasize that there's more to this than just checking a box on compliance, there's a lot of benefit to be realized. So I always like this slide. Thank you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Okay, so we've spoken about the fact that compliance is an inevitability, and we've spoken about the fact that it doesn't have to be such a bugbear on the organization in terms of grudge purchases in order to meet compliance and an avoidance of risk, etc. But there's actually an economic model that you can apply. What are those things that we're talking about specifically? Here's a few examples of them. So we're talking about retention laws. Different regions, different industries, different states all have different expectations in terms of the retention periods for different types of information. And that feeds into electronic record keeping, and that really talks about what can you keep in an electronic format and what can't you keep in an electronic format. And this is a changing landscape. We find that organizations like NARA are pushing to get as much as they can into the electronic record keeping formats. Privacy is certainly one of these things that you want to be, one of the pillars that you want to be managing. Data security is the most popular one, and that's what people think about often when we talk compliance, is immediately data security, but also intellectual property, which is a very complex legal landscape. And litigation preservation, meaning simply that in the presence of litigation, you are required to hold certain information and to have the mechanisms in place in order to be able to place those holds and maintain them. And then finally, policies. And what we mean here is if your record schedule says that you have a policy to maintain retention of a type of record for a certain period of time, and you're not doing it, then that puts you in a liable position as far as your liability is concerned or your exposure is concerned. Because, and I'm mentioning this because in a lot of organizations we find that they've gone through the effort of putting together a record schedule, and it says that we retain X type of record for X number of years. And what you'll actually find is that the enforcement of that record schedule is then difficult. And that's damning in terms of a low level of compliance to the policies that you have set yourself as an organization. And then finally, audits of all types. So from a compliance perspective, there's an expectation from customers perhaps that you should undergo audits from regulatory bodies. You should be audited on a regular basis in order to comply with certain regulations, and hand in hand with that is then mandated training on the ways to manage certain types of information. Not sure if you would add anything there, Todd.
I think you've hit all the boxes, sir.
Okie dokie. All right, and then this is a bit of a mouthful, and I apologize for reading off the screen, but this really says it succinctly, but it is a mouthful. So it's a compelling case. So think on this and try to apply it to your own organization. Though organizations often pursue these information-focused disciplines on an autonomous basis, the legal requirements in the discipline of records and information management, privacy and data security, intellectual property and litigation preservation seldom operate in a vacuum. So what we're saying is all of these things that we're mentioning are all under the same umbrella, but what we'll often find is that data security is the purview of the IT department, and litigation preservation maybe sits in a different department. And really, they're very, very closely interrelated. Instead, such legal requirements interrelate and interact across the respective disciplines' boundaries. Thus, when information is kept longer than required by records retention laws, the likelihood increases for a security breach under data security laws, for a disclosure jeopardizing trade secret status. Also, the volume of information subject to subsequent legal holds increases. So again, all of these things are interrelated. There is a bigger chance of a data breach if you are not compliant with your own record keeping policies. And so this really is speaking to the need of an organization to start to think about the fact that these things are so dependent on one another. Disposal of information in compliance with records retention and data security laws may violate litigation preservation requirements. So you may have a department that is completely compliant from a data security perspective, and in the process of doing that, they are violating litigation preservation requirements, or completely compliant from a records retention perspective and is creating risk from a data security perspective. And the processing and handling of information preserved and produced in litigation inevitably has an impact upon retention and records management compliance, and additionally may have intellectual property and privacy and data security repercussions. Again, every piece of information needs to be considered in all of these disciplines to see where they apply and where they don't apply, and what actions in one discipline will have an effect in another. The interplay of information legal requirements fosters the interdisciplinary approach of information governance, and while information-related compliance requirements create synergies for information governance, certain information legal requirements explicitly mandate that organizations establish foundational elements of an information governance program. So what we're saying here is this is not something that you can fracture and you can deal with in isolation within multiple different departments and say each business unit has a responsibility which is limited to X. Instead, we're really saying that we're reaching the point in terms of organizational expectations that there is an information governance program that marries all of these things together, and that there is a body that has this responsibility and understands this very, very complex legal set of legal and and otherwise requirements in totality. And really, after that mouthful, it makes it seem like governance and compliance is like this word cloud on the left-hand side there. And perhaps listening to all of this, or perhaps just as an experience of your day-to-day evolution, as you begin to understand the importance that is being imposed, or what is being imposed from a responsibility perspective onto organizations, how do we start with this? How do we grapple with this? How do we get a hold on this? And so on the right-hand side, I've got an example of how you might go about doing this. Obviously, the first thing that you would want to know is, what does our vision for information governance look like? And that it means, first of all, you need endorsement from stakeholders, and this needs to really be an organizational decision to become an information, a responsible information or informationally relevant organization, but also that you need to change the culture of the organization so that information responsibility is really baked into everybody's jobs. Once you have that vision and you've made that decision and you have the right endorsement, the next step is to assess where you are. A lot of organizations have file shares and integrated systems, and some of it is on premise and some stuff is being moved to the cloud. And really, you just need to understand where you're at. And that doesn't just mean in terms of the number of terabytes. It means understanding if our information, 12% of that is business critical, can we point to that 12%? If a percentage of that is, redundant, obsolete, then can we identify which information is and where that sits? These are the types of questions that you want to be answering as you go about assessing what your landscape looks like. And then finally, you need to develop some policies. Those policies will obviously be informed by what you found in your assessment and what you have decided to aim for as an information governance vision. But you need to develop a set of policies which make sense in terms of the way that you want to, first of all, comply with what you have to from a regulatory perspective, how you reduce your risk, and also what you are going to do to build a business case for this economic value of information governance. Once you have those policies in place, all sounds very easy when you do it this way, right? Once you have those policies in place, then you need to formulate a plan to determine how you're going to enforce those policies, how you're going to weigh risk, how you are going to implement a plan that encompasses all of the silos of information that you've identified and analyzed. And then I've got a piece in there that speaks to foundations. And really what this is about is, Microsoft 365 is a fantastic platform for productivity inside of the cloud. And if you have it implemented, you can start to collaborate and you can start to have redundancy of information, and there are a whole host of benefits. But you will not have a compliant information ecosystem in the cloud by flipping the switch on Microsoft 365. There is some work that needs to be done in order to take it from a solid cloud platform to a compliant information ecosystem that is relevant to your organization. And really, this is about laying those foundations and properly preparing that cloud platform to not only give you the productivity targets that you're looking for, but also the compliance targets. And then there may be some consolidation. So what that may mean is that generally what we find is as folks go through these silos and they start to identify the type of information and they start to grapple and understand the types of risk that they have and where that risk lies, and start to put in place a life cycle for managing the different types of information, what you'll find is that there is an economy of scale that you can take advantage of, and that consolidating certain types of information and moving things around, cataloging, classifying, and so forth, will bring a lot of benefit. And so you may want to consider what do we do with our information landscape? And that is not always, let's take everything and put it in the cloud. The reality is that most organizations are adopting a hybrid approach to information governance. And so you may be saying, well, some of the stuff doesn't need to be in the cloud. Maybe it's prohibitively expensive to keep it in the cloud. And if that's the case, how do we maintain it and still make it searchable and so forth if it's sitting on premise? And then a migration process. And this may be migration to the cloud. This may be migration to Microsoft 365. This may also just be a migration from those silos into a new information ecosystem that makes information more readily available, more searchable, lower risk, all of those good things that we're aiming for.
Ryan, a couple of key considerations and pieces based on what you've just really greatly described on the assessment piece. Absolutely. We don't stop assessing information systems, records, owners of records, all of those types of things. We're looking at the culture and the business every step of the way, because that leads in to number two. You didn't land on these huge volumes of information, or you're trying to come up with a plan in a reactive mode overnight. This has taken time to ramp up, and therefore it also takes time to create a solution, develop everything on this slide to get there. So this is a process, as we've probably heard many times before, but two key pieces we always look at when we take on these sorts of projects.
Yeah, true story. Okay, and then this slide really talks to approaching cloud maturity. It's information maturity as well. And you may have seen it on some of our previous webinars as well. The point that I wanted to make here, and I'm not going to belabor it, but it means that certain things come first, right? So most organizations are looking at, the buzz around big data and unlocking insight inside of your information and AI and machine learning, and all of these are fantastic things. And really, that is at the top end of the maturity scale. That is I would like to get insight from my information. I would like it to inform business decisions. I would like it to make me an agile organization, or to allow us to react to a changing economic environment, whatever that case may be. The fact of the matter is that if you unwind that string, you'll find that a lot of cases, the data is not, or the information is not in a place where it can provide insights, because it's not co-located, because of the volume of data, because it hasn't properly been classified, and it's not easily comparable to other types of information. And so you may find yourself slipping down this maturity scale. A lot of organizations are still grappling with, how do we connect our on-premises environments to our cloud environments and make them a homogeneous information ecosystem? And then once we have that, how do we make it safe? And then once it's safe, how do we make it compliant in terms of regulations that we have to abide by in the industry that we're in, and so forth and so on. And so this, the point I really wanted to make here is that you want to tackle these problems one layer at a time, because essentially you can't think about compliance if your information isn't safe. You can't think about data security if you haven't connected your environments, and so forth. Really, all it's about is about a progression. Okay, and then, so if you're talking about compliance, a lot of things that you'll see, especially from consulting organizations, have to do with these GRC programs, so governance, risk, and compliance. And really, these things do go hand in hand, and there's a lot of different flavors of these types of things. This is a rather well-known model that I'm demonstrating here that really talks about the fact that you want to have a compliance practice that is developing and implementing controls, processes, and programs to ensure compliance with all of the regulations that we've been talking about, and that those compliance designs are going to inform your governance, and we'll talk about that in a second, but also that you have things like compliance prioritization to say, given that we have a limited amount of capacity or a limited amount of budget, what do we prioritize over what in our compliance journey? On the other side of the spectrum, you have risk management, this process of continuously aligning and adapting your program to the organization's strategy, and then analyzing the weight of the liability and understanding where the risk lies, and then feeding that into the governance program. And essentially at the center of everything, you have this process, which is how do we take this information that we're receiving from risk management and compliance and turn it into a set of policies at its most basic level. It's an oversimplification, certainly, and then how do we turn that into an operational model that allows us to govern against those policies? And really what's underpinning that, as you can see in this slide, is the impact of non-compliance. Okay, and as we head towards wrapping up, this is then a more complex version of that. And really what we've tried to do on this talk is to start by defining what we're talking about, and then talk about how it's broken down, and then speak about how much more complex this information landscape is becoming. And we're landing on a slide here that is actually very complex when you start to talk about how do we tackle this in terms of a compliance, risk, and governance model. This differs from the previous slide in that, compliance and risk and governance are in different places, but really what we're talking about is You want a compliance program that allows you to monitor the compliance landscape and to, implement the types of controls that you need in order to maintain that compliance, and to self-assess continuously your systems, your processes, and your audit preparation, to do external audits, and to ultimately to give you a report that tells you the level of compliance that you have. And if you look towards, I know it's quite a complex diagram, but what you're aiming for as a process of marrying risk and compliance and governance are the two pieces that you see at the top there: continuous improvement and continuous compliance. This process that we're talking about, monitoring, self-assessing, external audits and reporting, organizations are aiming to be doing this continuously. Not we do an audit in 3 years and in 3 months that is no longer relevant, but rather we are able to assess our level of compliance day to day as we pursue this continuous compliance objective inside of our information governance. On the left-hand side of the screen, we're talking about the governance itself, laws, statutes, and regulations that feed into a set of standards and policies that the organization develops. And then those are augmented by customer contracts and business-to-business agreements to form a set of processes and procedures that the organization has vetted, and then the controls that you need in order to operationalize those processes and procedures and implement them throughout the organization as part of an adoption and change management program. And at the center of that, you have this framework where you need to be continuously categorizing your information, selecting the controls that you wish to use in order to assess risk, implementing controls to minimize that risk, doing things like doing authorizers, that someone who is in authority is able to look at the weight of the risk and make a decision on it, and obviously continuously monitor that system. And really what I wanted to show here, without getting into the weeds in terms of the complexities of these types of GRC systems, is that I suppose ultimately information governance and compliance is a very, very interrelated, sensitive, complex landscape, and that it's only becoming more so as time progresses. And that really these two objectives that we're talking about, continuous improvement and continuous compliance, that is being driven by the fact that we have rapid cloud adoption and that our information systems are evolving technologically very, very rapidly. And that there is now this expectation that we're not talking about compliance in the past, we're talking about compliance in the immediacy of what we are doing now. And that really that puts a huge burden on organizations in order to maintain these types of programs. And that putting together a program like this is less of a grudge or less of a ancillary program and more of a central function of every organization, in the same way as accounting systems would be. Yeah.
Okay, we've got our last poll. Okay, so most people have voted. Security breaches got 33% of the vote. Information privacy ended up with 61% of votes. And lack of personalization got 5%.
Thank you, GDPR, right, Brian?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks for all of your votes. That takes us about 6 minutes to the hour and a point where we talk about an offering for you. But First, a little recap. I think this topic can be very deep, and starting simple and leveraging some of the guidance and advice Ryan has shared on this call is going to be key. Assessing, strategizing, planning, and knowing that this is a continual process is really key, and focusing on what compliance standards you are held to within your organization to move forward. Without further ado, though, I'll turn it back to Ryan to talk about our workshop offer, before we close for today.
Yeah, so we recognize how difficult it is for folks to get a handle on their compliance story, and that in many cases it's difficult to figure out where to start. So one of the things that we wanted to offer for those of you who've worked your way through the entirety of our session this evening is that we have an offer for a free workshop. It's 4 hours in total. We normally spread them out over the course of a week, but it's essentially our assistance in providing both a cloud expert who understands M365 and cloud ecosystems, as well as a records and information governance expert who understands how to build systems that would be compliant on these platforms, to assist an organization in understanding where they're at. And that includes a pre-workshop survey, which is electronic. And then there are some informational analysis and records maturity analysis and a whole bunch of things that we can assist with. Essentially what it is an initial blush or a high level litmus that will allow you to evaluate where you are from a compliance standpoint.
It is a great offer, and the pre-workshop survey, I will say, helps us with understanding more about more than just a generic problem or just a generic issue. It really helps us start to frame up what you're dealing with. So please reach out to us for our workshop offer. And we're getting close on time, so I think we're getting close to ending, but I did want to plug, hopefully you all have enjoyed today's webinar, and next month's webinar will be on Microsoft 365 workflows and automation. That will be on the 15th. We are very much looking forward to that. We hope to see you on that one. And again, thanks for attending today. We hope our webinar today provided you with more additional insight and best practices to leverage your 365 investment. Any parting words, Ryan?
Yeah, thank you as always, Todd. It's a pleasure to shoot the breeze with you, sir. Looking forward to our next upcoming webinar, and hopefully we gave everyone something to think about from a compliance perspective.
Absolutely. Thank you for your time. Thanks for everyone attending. Please stay safe, please stay healthy, and we'll see you soon.
Bye, everyone.